So for those of you who are standing up, could I ask you to find a seat? We'll be starting momentarily. Like I said earlier, we have a guest joining us from Washington, D.C. We're waiting for them to connect, so please be patient. And for those of you who can hear me out in the internet land, in the virtual space, welcome to the forecast. Your audio should be working. Good. Okay, I just got the thumbs up from the back of the room from our multimedia faceted event for this evening, and I want to say welcome to everybody. My name is Scott Sternberg. I'm with the Boulder Economic Council, and tonight we thought it appropriate to recognize the recent events occurring in both Superior, Louisville, and in unincorporated Boulder County. And so to that point, we have a very special guest that we've arranged this evening to do a live broadcast from Washington, D.C. So without further ado, I think you all know this gentleman. Please join me in welcoming Senator John Hickenlooper to address the community for us this evening.
Can you hear me, Scott?
I certainly can. Thank you so much for being here.
Good. Well, thank you for having me, Scott. And I appreciate everybody who's part of this discussion, or I guess a presentation. I'm sneaking off of the floor of the Senate, where we've been looking at voting rights all day. I think we've probably had 20 or 25 different floor speeches. It's been a long day, but I am ready and really happy to get a chance to talk to you guys a little bit just on how challenging it's been. And Lord knows, those 8 years when I was governor, we had so many wildfires and floods. And my heart, I just want to say that before I say anything else, that my heart is really with all of you in Boulder, and the victims and the family members, the friends, the entire community in terms of the Marshall Fire. It's such a hard thing to even imagine that could happen. Anyway, I guess my job, what I wanted to do is come on and give you a little bit of encouragement, because I do know that in the weeks immediately after a disaster, it's a steep hill. And that's where that whole notion, now that it's become a big legislative bill in Washington, the notion of Build Back Better has kind of become diluted. But when we first started, at least when I first used the term and heard about it in 2013, and we'd had the wildfires, several really large wildfires, the shooting in Aurora, and then the flood in September of 2013. And we clearly felt that well, you just couldn't build things back the way they were. Our goal was to rebuild the community, all those canyons, all those towns and counties have been flooded out, to build it back better. You just can't say you're going to build it back what you had. It's not good enough when people have lost so much. And this is very different for me because I'm on the federal side, but I knew the federal side pretty well when I was governor as well. And I think FEMA's got there. They had someone on the ground the next day. They've already distributed $725,000 already in direct payments to people that suffered the consequences of that fire. And there's another $30 million that's going to go out in loans and help people rebuild and rebuild their businesses. We're also, you can't help but recognize how hard it is to go through that kind of a disaster in the middle of a pandemic. And the economy has already been knocked on its back. And I just want to reassure everybody, especially the small businesses, that we're not backing away. We're not going to drop the ball. We passed that bipartisan infrastructure bill, one of the first bills I got to actually really work on, roll up my sleeves and be part of the negotiations. And that's got a lot of resources coming into Colorado that are going to make a real difference. And they're spread out over a number of years. So this is, I think, is going to be a long-term tailwind that's going to help every business be a little more successful. Over $225 million in bridge repairs, $917 million in federally approved highway projects. A bare minimum, just to start, there'll be $100 million to make sure broadband goes all over the state. And I'm sure you guys all know that we have pockets in Boulder County where we don't have the broadband that we need as well. So in addition to that, we've also put together the first set of earmarks we've had in a number of years. Michael Bennett and I both worked real hard to get a couple of earmarks into Boulder County. There's the $225,000 for the Boulder Crisis Intervention Response Initiative, and I think I got that right. But that's, again, these have been approved, but the money hasn't been actually fully allocated yet. But I think that's just, we'll get that done this summer. And then also there's $950,000 for the JILA lab, as part of CU, in partnership with NIST. And that's a lot of our most advanced things like quantum computing and those things. I think these are the types of benefits that are, or investments that are going to help the economy come back stronger and stronger. I realize that this is hollow for those of you who've lost homes. I walked that area a week and a half ago, and it was overwhelming. Just the immensity of how many homes were lost and completely burned to the ground. I mean, I've seen it before, but somehow this seemed different. But I do know, and it's great to be talking to the Chamber of Commerce, I know that a good business community, and there's no better business community in Colorado than what you find in Boulder County, but a business community is there when you go through hard times. And I want to give you my word, my commitment that we'll do everything we can to make sure that the federal government is an active partner as you guys do build back better. And by that I mean, build something that's just more resilient and better suited to the purposes than what was lost. And I know that a robust business community like we have in Boulder is going to always play an immense role in making sure that we come back from these kinds of tragedies. So thanks for letting me have a few minutes. I realize I'm kind of squeezed into the beginning of a long program, so I'll step aside and turn it back to you guys. Thanks, Scott, and thanks all of you. I look to getting out there and being there in person as soon as we get past this Omicron little obstacle. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much. If you can still hear me, Senator Hickenlooper, it's such a treat to have you, and we're just so happy to have someone who understands both the business, the innovation economy that we have here in Colorado and in Boulder, and resonates with all the residents and what they've been going through. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, if you can still hear me.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2022 Economic Forecast, Boulder and Beyond. Tonight's event is presented by Elevations Credit Union and the Boulder Economic Council, which serves as the economic development arm of the Boulder Chamber. My name is Scott Sternberg. I serve as the Executive Director of the Boulder Economic Council, or the BEC, as we call it. And it's my privilege to welcome you all here in person, here at the Jewish Community Center, as well as all of you that have decided to join us online. And we appreciate the fact that those of you that are here. It's quite a snowy and slick evening, so we appreciate the effort to come out. But we also appreciate the time that you all are spending with us in our virtual connection, and hopefully you'll be able to hear all of the content here clearly and completely here this evening. So thank you again. In addition to the Senator's remarks, we've arranged 2 individuals that represent the Department of Commerce and specifically the Economic Development Administration to join us tonight. They have pre-recorded video messages for us this evening. The first one will be from Alejandra Castillo, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, and Angie Martinez, the Regional Director for the Denver Regional Office, U.S. Department of Commerce, Economic Development Administration. So let's watch their recorded remarks this evening, and I think you'll find them very pertinent to this evening's discussion.
Hello, I'm Alejandra Castillo, and I'm honored to serve President Biden and our nation as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development. On behalf of the Biden-Harris administration, I extend our heartfelt condolences to the community as you mourn those lost and work to rebuild following the devastating wildfires that impacted the region on December 30th. Like you, we felt the impact at the Department of Commerce, where we were saddened to learn that some of our employees were among those who lost their homes in the tragic fires that destroyed more than 1,000 residences. We also know that 37 commercial structures were damaged or destroyed, and that the long-term impact to businesses large and small will be significant. As President Biden said when he visited Louisville on January 7th and declared a national disaster, the federal government is here for you and will continue to be here for you. We are committed to making sure you have everything you need to recover and build back better. In fact, our commitment began the day the fire started. The President immediately mobilized federal firefighting equipment, satellite imagery from the Department of Defense, and additional federal personnel to support the response. When the governor requested the expanded major disaster declaration, the President approved it right away on New Year's Eve. And to help families directly, we surged resources support for temporary housing, home repairs, and debris removal. Critically, the Disaster Assistance Center in Lafayette was opened to provide a hub to plug families and small businesses into available federal support. And we continue to work closely with Governor Polis to ensure Colorado has every single resource available. At the U.S. Economic Development Administration, or EDA, which I am privileged to lead, we have a long history of successfully supporting disaster recovery and resiliency efforts. EDA's role in disaster recovery is to facilitate the timely and effective delivery of federal economic development assistance to support long-term community economic recovery planning and project implementation, redevelopment, and resilience. You will be hearing more about EDA's role from our Denver Regional Office Director, Angie Martinez, today. Angie and her team, including Colorado Economic Development Representative Trent Thompson and Economic Development Integrator Zach Graves, have been actively engaged and are exploring ways that EDA can assist. I want to thank the firefighters, first responders, and community for the inspiration you provide by coming together as Americans first to rebuild. I commend the Boulder Chamber of Commerce and the Northwest Chamber Alliance on your unifying efforts to work together to support the regional business recovery. The road ahead will be long and challenging as you seek to rebuild by supporting businesses' recovery, growth, and vitality. The bottom line is, we've all got to work together to build back and build back better. You have our commitment that we will stay with you as long as it takes. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Angie Martinez, and I serve as the Regional Director for a small but growing bureau within the U.S. Department of Commerce called the Economic Development Administration. I'm sure most of you are familiar with EDA's sister bureaus who are based in Boulder and contribute to the vibrant economy and region. These are the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. As you heard from our Assistant Secretary, many of the employees who work at these labs live in the surrounding region, and some were impacted by the Marshall Fire. Alejandra reached out to me immediately to ensure that our team was safe, and although she couldn't join you in person, she wanted to send her regards, so I appreciate the opportunity to share her video as well. John and Scott asked me to say a few words today about economic recovery after a disaster. Although I suspect right now it's hard to think about what is needed for long-term recovery when so many of you are focused on the urgent and immediate needs of the families and businesses impacted by the fires. As the Assistant Secretary said, please know that the U.S. Economic Development Administration is here to help your communities as you begin the work to build back from the Marshall Fire. EDA has a long history of successfully supporting disaster recovery and resiliency efforts. While we're not a first responder like FEMA, over our history, we've partnered with numerous disaster-impacted communities to help them not just build back what was there before, but to implement a vision that makes their community and economy more resilient and stronger. And even though we're not a disaster response agency, our staff was reaching out to our partner agencies to start organizing a coordinated recovery effort within days of the fire. And EDA is positioned to provide resources for several stages of disaster recovery. At the early stages of post-disaster recovery, EDA grants can help organizations create economic recovery and resiliency plans, sometimes with the assistance of EDA-funded disaster recovery coordinators, essentially funding staff capacity to devote to recovery efforts. As these recovery efforts progress, EDA funds can be used to finance construction of new infrastructure or infrastructure repair and enhancements to diversify economies and strengthen resilience to future disasters. Examples include business incubators, technology parks, research facilities, access roads, storm drainage, water treatment facilities, and other resilient infrastructure. At EDA, we say our entire budget is like a rounding error in some of our fellow federal agency budgets. But EDA punches above its weight, and we ensure that our limited dollars are maximized to best support the communities we serve. EDA funding can help communities develop a more robust, diversified, and resilient economy through planning, technical assistance, and core capacity building investments that help businesses, along with state, local, and tribal governments, prepare for and bounce back from disasters. In the EDA region that I represent, we have many examples of our working with communities and regions to rebound from a natural disaster, especially from fires, floods, and tornadoes. I've personally had the honor of visiting some of these communities to mark the completion of an EDA rebuilding project, and I've witnessed the strength and resiliency of a community that's been through so much together and how much it means for them to celebrate milestones in their recovery. Somewhat recently, EDA helped support the recovery in San Juan County after the Gold King mine spill. That region got a double whammy when the 416 fire shut down the Durango and Silverton narrow gauge railroad and the highway that normally brings hundreds of visitors to Silverton in the summer. We quickly worked with the community to expand the grant, and we helped them pivot to a stronger diversification strategy so that the region was not so dependent on summer tourism. With EDA support, the region created an opportunity zone prospectus to attract new businesses as well as remote workers. They undertook a community visioning effort to develop and expand a master plan for a community center. They developed a community food drive and established a food bank for those in need due to loss of employment. And they offered a microloan program for Silverton businesses. And over in Estes Park, EDA partnered with the community to establish the Base Camp business incubator that supports businesses that operate year-round, not just seasonally. The investment was in response to the impacts of both the pandemic and the East Troublesome Fire that shut down Rocky Mountain National Park and resulted in a major blow to the local economy. In Joplin, Missouri, after the catastrophic tornado that took lives and leveled much of the city, EDA invested in several projects that supported job training and creation and community rebuilding. And in Minot, North Dakota, After a flood destroyed most of the downtown, EDA helped rebuild the downtown infrastructure that allowed businesses to come back and the heart of the community to begin to beat again. I share these examples with you because I want to remind you that recovery will come and EDA will be here to work with you. What I love so much about my agency is that we don't dictate what your recovery should look like. We don't just invest in building back exactly what was lost, but we support the development and implementation of your vision and your strategy for not only bouncing back from the disaster, but bouncing forward. To conclude, I want to again thank those of you working to speed the recovery and to build back stronger. You have a really great spirit of collaboration to build your efforts upon, and I encourage you to keep collaborating. There's really power in that collaboration, and by working together, you will lift each other up and continue to move this region forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to say thank you to Alejandra for taking the time out of what is an extraordinarily busy schedule to really come down to our local community and make remarks. I've been on the phone with Angie most of the day. I know she wanted to be here, and I'm hoping, Angie, you're seeing me on camera here. I know you're joining me virtually. Thank you so much for your contribution this evening, and we very much appreciate it. Indeed, it will take a collaborative and creative support infrastructure to get us going into the road of recovery. So thank you so much. Before I begin tonight's keynote presentations, I also want to highlight one other individual. She doesn't know I'm going to be doing this, but I do think it's worth noting Tatiana Hernandez is in the audience with us tonight from the Community Foundation. As a Louisville resident myself, many of my friends are going through a very difficult time, and when you ask them what do they need most now, they need relief, which is code for money. And Tatiana shared with me just moments ago that I believe the Marshall Fire Fund has now gone over $22 million. And so I recognize the Community Foundation for just extraordinary work and you personally for your leadership of that organization. And I think, you know, from the top down, what we've tried to do at these opening remarks is show that from the senator's seat, from the Department of Commerce, from EDA, and from all of you that are contributing through organizations like the Community Foundation, indeed, we will be back better and we will get through this recovery. So thank you so much for all of the community work that you've had. So, as they say, now for the main event. Tonight's keynote program are featuring three individuals that many of you probably know, but certainly all of us respect. We have tonight with us the State Demographer Elizabeth Garner. We have CU Boulder economists, both Rich Wobbekind and Brian Lewandowski, that will be joining us and speaking with us this evening. Many of you in the room and many of you out there in the virtual world are very familiar with Chamber and Boulder Economic Council events, and many of you are highly supportive of our events, and we cannot do this type of programming without your support. We know how critical your support is and how critical sponsorship is in producing events such as these. We fully appreciate your support, especially at times like these where we need to be getting the message out and tapping into the resources, some of which you heard about this evening already. So you all make this event possible for all of us, and we thank you so much for that. So at this point, I would like to recognize those sponsors that have made this evening possible. Our presenting sponsor tonight, and you will hear from a representative from this organization, Elevations Credit Union. Thank you so much. I would say our community sponsor, but certainly a very strong and endeared partner with the Boulder Chamber and the Economic Council, the City of Boulder. We have a long list of supporting sponsors for this evening's events. They are Berg Hill, Greenleaf, and Rushidi, BOK Financial, CLA, Ide Bailey, Flatiron Crossing, Plant Moran, Premier Members Credit Union, the University of Colorado at Boulder, of course, and the 29th Street Mall. Thank you all for your supporting sponsorship. And last and certainly not least, getting the message out to our community is a critical facet for everything we do at the Chamber, and we are very fortunate to have both BizWest and the Daily Camera as our media sponsors for this evening. Thank you so much for your support. Continuing on, I would also like to acknowledge and thank all of the elected officials and their staff that have at least indicated that they would be joining us here tonight. It's been kind of a crazy event for us, so hopefully if you're not here in person, thank you so much for those of you who are joining us online. Certainly members from our congressional staff, our state legislator, the Boulder County commissioners, and of course many of the City of Boulder employees that are joining us here tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the community, our businesses, our industries, our research and educational leaders, all of which are in the audience tonight. So thank you all so much for your support. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't thank my manager and my mentor, John Taylor from the Boulder Chamber, whose tireless efforts are constantly supporting our community and making events and our community stronger through business. So thank you very much, John, for the support that you bring us. So at this time, I would like to introduce our presenting sponsor from Elevations Credit Union. I'd like to call Michael Calcote, the CFO of Elevations Credit Union, to the podium for his opening remarks and introduction of our speaker. Michael?
Thank you, Scott. It's an honor to be here this evening. We're grateful to support the Boulder Economic Council and their marquee events as presenting sponsor. These events provide important information to our business community. Elevations has served the Boulder community for almost 70 years. With roots on the campus of CU Boulder, we're so appreciative of our community and the support that you provided Elevations over the years. Elevations is a full-service, not-for-profit financial institution. In 2021 alone, we provided over $2.5 billion of loans to the communities and the membership that we serve. As CFO, I felt obligated to insert at least $1 amount into my comments, okay? Now, I'd like to provide a little bit of background information on the three speakers this evening. First and foremost, our kickoff speaker tonight is Elizabeth Garner, the State Demographer. Elizabeth has over 25 years of experience analyzing population and economic trends in the state. She and her staff produce population and economic estimates and forecasts used by the state agencies and local governments, and tonight's presentation will feature data from the 2020 census. Our next speaker tonight is no stranger to the economic forecast. Dr. Rich Wobbekind is Senior Economist and Associate Dean at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He joined the faculty at the Leeds School of Business in 1985 and has served as Associate Dean since 2000. He will be joined by Brian Lewandowski, Executive Director of the Business Research Division at CU Boulder Leeds School of Business. With that, please join me in welcoming Elizabeth to the stage.
I didn't go over how to use the clicker, so we're just gonna, I lost an earring. I know, remind me I did that, all right? Because otherwise I'm gonna end up just with one. Just remember it's somewhere behind me. All right, I'm gonna make sure this works. Yes. All right, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I always enjoy coming up to Boulder. And a couple of things before I start, the tragedies that have occurred up here in Boulder aren't going to be reflected in my numbers. But I don't want you to think that I'm not thinking of you guys and not thinking about, well, why the heck hasn't she done that yet? Part of it is that we operate on a different calendar year. With different estimates and forecasts. And I am going to be talking primarily about Census 2020 and the results for Boulder County and the communities in Boulder. But with the disaster occurring on the 30th of December in 21, The numbers actually won't be reflected until July of '22. So for actually most of this year, you're going to be operating off of the numbers that were used for 2020, well, 2020 for a little bit, and then 21 will actually be off of these numbers all the way until July of the following year. So just know that we know that things have happened, so it's not that we're trying to not pay attention, it's just the way that we're operating with the numbers. So what are some of the big things that we're looking at for the state as well as for Boulder that I think we need to take into account that will have long-run impacts in Colorado? One is that we're actually slowing down in terms of population growth. And I think that that's a really important message, and especially for media that's here. Things are slowing down. And so sometimes you hear from media all the time, exponential growth, people flocking to the state. And I'm like, are you actually looking at the numbers I release? I know. So we need to make sure that we're messaging correctly about what actually is taking place in the state. So we are slowing down. We've seen that slow down, especially for the last 5 to 6 years. Primarily because, one, we see births slowing down. And you probably don't notice that, right? They just hang outside in the house. You know, they're not going places. But if you've been watching things with like Toys R Us, closing down facilities, you would know that births are slowing. Deaths are increasing, not just COVID deaths, regular deaths as well, primarily because we're older. So we've got these two trends that are putting downward pressure on population growth. We're also slowing down in terms of migration. Just frankly, Colorado hasn't been as competitive as historical trends simply because it's a little bit more expensive. But also mobility in the United States as a whole is slowing down. And so that's going to put downward pressure on movement. We're seeing concentrated growth, which we've probably recognized, primarily along the I-25 corridor in the Front Range. We're also aging, and if you've heard me before, I talk about it all the time. You know, didn't you wake up a day older today? So we're doing this, we're doing it a lot, and it's the biggest part of our growth. So especially from a business sense, aging is something that everybody should be watching because it impacts everything. Consumers and your labor force especially. So that's some of the key messages that I want you guys to take away, as well as the fact that we are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, especially in our youngins. Those that are aging into the labor force. So when we're looking at who are our next employees, we need to make sure that our lens is correct in terms of how we're looking at recruiting and retaining and training our new employees. So what did we find out with the Census 2020 count? Well, the US increased by 22 million people, but it was the second slowest growth rate that they had experienced for a decennial census. The largest decline, or the slowest rate, was during the Great Depression in the 1930s. So we're at about 331 million in 2020. Colorado reached 5.7 million, an increase of about 744,000 over the decade, a growth rate of 14%, so quick math, you can see twice as fast as the US as a whole. Sixth in percentage change across the ranked in all of the states, 9th in numeric change, but just enough for all of the great drama that took place with our 8th congressional seat. Thank goodness that piece is over. So just for perspective, and again, just to help those that are potentially math challenged, I want you to see growth since 1900 in Colorado. The blue bars are the total growth. The orange line is growth rate. So that we can see that indeed the last couple of decades, there is nothing exponential in our growth. So please say with me, no exponential growth. That is bad messaging across the board because it puts our emphasis on the wrong thing. It's not the people that's the problem. It's potentially how we manage it. And so thinking about things differently, I think, is more helpful in terms of moving forward, because I will tell you, I'm the state demographer, I'm a fan of people, okay? And it's not just because it's my job, they serve such an important part. And fortunately, Rich and Brian are gonna be after me talking about the economy, but I'm gonna really encourage you to think about the value of people in terms of their employees. They bring not just that, but their value to our communities. So important to be thinking about people in a different sense. So when we saw growth in Colorado, where did we see it? We saw it along the Front Range. 95% of our growth was in the Front Range, so the red, orange, yellow is positive. All of the shades of blue are decline. We had 16 counties decline in population. Total aggregate decline was about 7,200 people. Not that much. So it's not like we saw a big decline in a lot of those counties, but enough to where there were declines. Compared to the previous decade, 78% of our growth was along the Front Range. So fundamentally, there was a change, and that could be what's making us feel a little bit different. But I'll also encourage you to think about what were the types of jobs that we created over the last decade that could have forced most of that growth or encouraged most of that growth along the Front Range. I always like to show this, especially for folks that are in the Front Range, to understand the rest of the state. It's fine to show the map of the state in red, orange, yellow, blue. It's fine. But this is looking at the total change for every county in the state along the horizontal axis. 10 counties dominated the growth in the state. There's 64. Okay, so this means that really most of our counties float around zero in terms of total population change. And so I think it's important to recognize that in terms of understanding growth in the state. If we look at Boulder and we look at the growth in Boulder over the decade between 2010 and 2020, Boulder County as a whole increased by about 36,000 people, a growth rate of 12%, so a little bit slower than the state as a whole. You can see what the different municipalities within the county grew by, and sometimes if you see that where it's in parentheses like part, that's because the municipal boundaries actually go outside the county of Boulder as well. So you can see some of the parts of the county grew faster and slower than others, which I'm sure that most of you guys recognize, but important to see there. And actually, Boulder grew a little bit faster this decade than previous decades. So kind of important to recognize that change. When we look at total population change over the time frame that starts in 1970, our growth is driven by two pieces, well, it's actually three pieces: births, deaths, and net migration. Important to understand that births were 648,000 of our growth over the decade. Deaths were about 362,000 over the decade. Net migration was a little over 445,000. So what did you see as the number one component of growth? Births, yes. So how many of you have ever complained about growth? Come on, be fair, raise those hands. You're complaining about babies. But important to recognize really what these components are, because honestly, the media also gets it wrong. They'll say, you know, like the state grew by 744,000, people moved to the state. And I'm like, no, that's not what happened. So important always to get the numbers right on it. So on this chart, what you see in the blue is natural increase, which is births minus deaths. Red is net migration. You'll see that we peaked in 2015 and we've been slowing ever since. So even pre-COVID, we saw this slowdown in our population change. The births minus deaths, we're seeing the fact that we're seeing this increase in deaths and a slowdown in births, and then net migration slowing down as well. If we look at the same values for the Boulder County, on this chart, you'll see that The births are kind of gray, the purple is the deaths, and then the green is net migration, and the blue is a combination of total population change. And what we can see is over time a narrowing of that distance between births and deaths. Contrary to the rest of the state, the births in Boulder peaked in about 2001 and have been shrinking ever since. We've seen a nice steady increase in deaths. That's normal, we're getting older. And then you can see that net migration goes all over the place. That big loss in net migration in 2000 is just Broomfield's fault. That's all it has to do, is the fact that we carved part of Boulder out to create Broomfield. But important to see that we're starting to see a narrowing of that growth within Boulder County. Early on in the decade, we were seeing annual increases of about 5,000. Toward the end of the decade, we saw increases closer to 2,000 or 3,000. So we're seeing that growth slowing down primarily because of that narrowing of the births and deaths. So I want to talk about births because I think they're really important. We're seeing that births are slowing down not only for Colorado, but for the United States, and that's what this chart shows. And the orange are the births in Colorado, and the blue, it's the births in the United States. We reached our peak birth in 2007. That makes our peak person about 14 years old. So obviously K-12 has been thinking about this. Higher ed is panicked because they already saw a declining enrollment pre-kids not coming, not being born, not coming, if you understand all that. Called it's like the student cliff, I think. But we're seeing it, and we've got more women of childbearing age. This is gonna have a huge impact to our labor force, because that's the next thing. So in 4 years, they won't come. And it's really important to understand that people are a totally different factor of production than like land, labor, or land and capital. You can build more buildings, you can build more machines. It takes 25 good years to get a person in place, right? I mean, any parents out there? 25 is generous, right? Yes, we can import them, but guess what? This is happening from all over the country. So then the question would be, how welcoming are we internationally to migration? If we look across the United States, there was an absolute decline of 1 million under the age of 18 over the decade. All of the shades of blue are states that experience an absolute decline in their under 18, about 27 of them. You'll see California on there, which is really important to Colorado because that's where a lot of students come from to fill our universities. So yes, universities are panicked when they see this. Midwest has been uber competitive, trying to get our kids out of Colorado to go to their schools. Same with East Coast, Northeast. So this is something else to be thinking about, and the importance of marrying higher ed and economic development. Because a lot of these states, if they can get that kid in a seat in their university outside of Colorado, they have a greater likelihood of keeping them than trying to get them from Colorado to Indiana, let's say, later. And I will be honest with you, both my kids left. They paid less, well, I paid less, let's be honest, for their education out of state than I would have in state. That's not right. Okay, they were both super smart, they got great merit aid, and our universities couldn't match it. We've got to be thinking about that because, again, kids are going to be a premium soon. Well, right now. If we look in the state, what did we see? Colorado's population under 18 only increased by 38,000. Of that 744,000, only 38,000 were in the kiddos. All of the shades of blue are counties that experienced an absolute decline in the under 18 population. 43 of the 64. There is no region in the state that avoided a loss. We see it the San Luis Valley, Eastern Plains, Western Slope, Denver Metro. Now, it's not really unusual to see the fact that actually Boulder, again, declined in their under 18 population. You did it last decade as well, a decline of about 640. But it's important to know that that has long-run impacts out into the future. So I hit the births and deaths. Migration. When we migrate people to Colorado, who do we typically migrate? We migrate young adults. Kind of 22 to 37 is our bread and butter. Again, they're going to start to become a premium. How come it's not going now? There we go. Boulder, who do you attract? Super young. Those 20-year-olds, God help you. No, they're mostly the students that show up in there, and then you see this pretty significant out-migration from about 25, 30 on. No question in terms of why that typically happens. It's very expensive for somebody starting out to afford a home in the county. But you also see the impact of the university. But again, across the board, you have a net out-migration at all age groups. So a lot of the question is, how do you then attract and or retain population to the county when you see this net out at the older than 30 age group? This will link very much to Rich and Brian's presentation. When we talk about migration, it's so important to understand that there's this direct correlation with job growth. When we see stronger job growth, we tend to see more net migration, and that's what this chart shows. In the blue is job growth, red line is net migration, and we've seen this relationship over the time, but the big question right now is, what is going to be the future of job growth? And what is going to be the future of jobs? And what's going to be the future of employment? And what's going to be the future of labor? To see if in the future this same correlation takes place when people can start to work from anywhere. So a couple of things that you'll see here is our forecast in the short run is to see a very quick bounce back in jobs. So you see that tall blue bar in the middle, bouncing back fairly quickly. I'm afraid to touch a button on here. I know that there's probably a pointer. I know. Yeah, there we go. There we go. That one right there. So we're fairly confident that we're going to see a pretty big bounce back in the short run between now and 2025. That looks so big primarily because of the jobs that we lost. But then, more dramatically, look down here. We're actually forecasting pretty slow job growth out into the future, so long run. Why? Because we're seeing this in the United States forecast as well, a slowdown in job growth. Why? Because we're seeing a slowdown in the population and the labor force. A job doesn't count as a job unless it's filled. And that's really important to remember. And it's also really important to remember that a job is a person. I know that seems pretty intuitive, but across the state, and I'm not going to pick on Boulder at all on this, across the state, we have seen folks against housing. And that has been a challenge. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. And I know that that probably hurts a little thinking about that because of the loss of, between 1,000 and 1,200 housing units in Boulder. But it definitely in the state, and again, I'm not saying Boulder specifically, people are like, yes, I love jobs. I hate people. It doesn't work. We really need to change our mindset and the thought of people and the importance of people in this mix. Because otherwise, Rich and Brian won't be able to do a job forecast unless you've got the people. We need the people to make it work. Aging exacerbates it. Why? Because we've got a lot of older adults. And I'm almost there. I'm not saying I'm there. I'm almost there. We've got a lot of aging in Colorado, and it really impacts our preferences, where we buy, what we do, how much money we have, and if we are in the labor force. It impacts the type of housing, the size, how much money we make, and also the services that we need. So part of what we've seen in Colorado over the last decade in terms of job growth has been in the health services industry. 100% driven by aging. And so some people have started to say, hey, you know what, maybe we need to change up how we do job growth in the Front Range and constrain health services. And I'm like, what did you just say? Health services are here because we're here. It's not like you can change that up. So it's important to think about what's driving what. This is Colorado's age distribution broken down by single year of age. There's a black line at age 65. A couple of things you're going to take away. One, our peak person's 29 years old. And that's kind of that end piece of the millennials. Look how steep the slope is on the left-hand side. Like there's fewer 0-year-olds than there are 60-year-olds. So we can see this slowdown coming in from the left-hand side and the young. But on the right-hand side, the other piece that you can see is a lot of people aging into that 65 plus. The reason why aging is significant in Colorado is that we've never been older before. We've just never had a lot of older adults. We've got a ton of boomers, and they're the ones that are making the biggest difference in terms of this population change. This is Boulder County. So obviously you see the students. You can even see the steeper slope on the left-hand side in terms of slowdown in kiddos. And you can see that, you know, besides that kid factor, you've got a lot of older adults. And that is what's driving a lot of things in the county as a whole, but also be thinking about how this is going to impact your labor force out into the future in terms of people actively working in the labor force. So if we do the forecast for Colorado, looking at where our growth is, what we can see is that really in absolute terms and percentage change, the 65 plus over the next decade is forecast to be the largest age group to grow. That's in that last grouping. Very little growth in the 0 to 17, a little bit of growth in the 18 to 24. Only if we can convince them to migrate here will we get that 25 to 44, very slow in the 45 to 64, and then a lot of growth in the 65 plus. So over the next decade, we're forecast to increase by about 740,000, 332,000 just in the 65 plus. That's 45% of our total growth in the 65 plus. Now, if you remember from the chart that I showed showing net migration to the state, we're not Arizona or Florida. We're not migrating those 65 plus. Friends, it's birthdays. So it's gonna be fun growing that 65 plus, but remember it comes from within. It's ourselves. And yeah, let's see. Yeah, math-wise, I will make it. I will be in that growth to that 65 plus over this decade, and guess what? I'm not leaving. I'll probably even stay in my own house. And guess what? I'm not going to give it up to the next state demographer. So there. But the question is, and I'm at the tail end, or I'm at the beginning of the Xers, there's a lot of people in front of me that are going to do the same thing. So when we're looking at housing, we need to take into account that there's just going to be a lot more people staying and aging in place compared to historical trends, simply because we've never had this happen before. We're going to see about 500,000, maybe a little bit more, age out of the labor force over the next 10 years. And I bet they're not going to leave, or at least not all of them. I think that most of them are going to be fans, and they're going to stay here. So something to be thinking about. When we look for Boulder County, we'll see how many people get the aha soon. We can look at the total change. For the under 17, or the 17 and under, looking at an absolute decline. Pretty flat for the 18 to 24, a slight increase for the 25 to 44, A little bit of a decline in the 46 to 64, pretty significant increase in that 65 plus. If we look at the numbers, the total population is forecast to increase by about 23,700. The total population for the 65 plus forecast to increase by 23,300. Almost all of your growth is forecast to be in that 65 plus. Now, granted, there's some minuses in there, so some negative numbers to take into account, but this is really significant to be thinking about, because not only do we need to think about them aging out of the labor force, but we also need to think about what industries are they going to be driving. Also be thinking about how do we retain them, because they probably have money and they're probably spending it in county, and they're an important economic driver to be thinking about in and of itself. So again, another thing to be thinking about. So I'm not going to go over all of the implications from aging, but just remember that aging really will impact consumer demand and job demand. So the whole idea that we can slow down on certain industries, take into account what age group is driving them, and if you think that there's any chance you're going to slow down aging. I've tried, not working. Impact on your labor force, obviously a huge impact on housing and household size. So it's not just looking at the aging, but looking at all age groups and the impact on housing. You know, and I always make fun of my mom on this. She's 85 in the house that I grew up in, 3,500 square feet, living alone. And I can only tell her this, but she's a waste of a housing resource, right? That housing resource was created for 5 people, and there's 1. Now, should people be allowed to age in place? Absolutely. But it's something different than what we've seen historically. So that persons per household assumptions that people make need to be re-examined to make sure that they're still accurate, thinking about who is in those housing units. We're also seeing millennials, if you can believe it. Millennials are aging into second home buying age. Dun, dun, dun. They're huge. They are a huge generation. They're aging into the 40 plus, which tends to be second home buyers. Then we've got the little Gen Zs are actually also aging in to apartments and home buying themselves. So we've got a lot of demand for housing coming in. So take that into account as well. And if you thought that was enough on housing, I'm going to give you even more. So weird stuff with Census 2020. We got numbers that showed that housing increased in the state by 278,000 over the decade. And everybody's like, wow, that's cool. And I'm like, I wonder how many were created last decade. Oh, that was 404,000. We actually had more population growth this decade than last decade, yet 126,000 fewer housing units were built. I wonder why the housing market felt so tight. Why do we have this problem with our disequilibrium in terms of housing production and population growth? That is, I think, definitely one, and I know Brian's gonna tell me, Elizabeth, it's macro versus micro, and I'm like, I know, you've given me that lecture before. But it's something that I think that we can look at and work on better in the state, because producing too much housing is a problem, and producing not enough housing is a problem. There were 6 counties that actually produced more housing this last decade: Denver, Boulder, Jefferson, and then Cheyenne, Alamosa, and Bend. But most of the counties obviously then produced a lot fewer housing units over the decade. If we look at a trend over time looking at housing unit growth, this starts in 1990. The orange bars is housing units, the black line is household formation. And you know, you would think the idea is that households and housing units should grow in tandem. We don't do it in Colorado, primarily because we have a lot of blips. We had the early recession in the early 2000s, the tech bust, that threw us for a loop, and that created a lot of the problems that led actually into the Great Recession, because what did we do? We overproduced housing units during this time frame. And that did lead into the Great Recession, and it killed a lot of companies, a lot of firms, right? So then we stopped building. And we stopped building for about 10 years. So it was funny, I was talking to a colleague the other day, and they're like, yeah, no, I was talking to someone, they were talking about this housing boom that's going on. And I'm like, housing boom? Where? Well, if you only looked from 2010 to 2020, you might think there was a boom. If you looked historically, you would say, oh no, we're just kind of average. So it's so important to start and stop your points in different perspectives to understand what's driving different pieces. Big piece that I think everybody should be keeping an eye on, which is odd, we've seen household formation fall simply because population growth has slowed down. We've finally got housing units coming back online for about 3 years now. Why are we still feeling such tight pressure on housing prices? It's a question to the audience. I don't expect you to answer me, but it's something that I'm very curious about in terms of understanding why we're still feeling that. I thought I'd throw Boulder's housing permits in here just for a second. It's a great tool that you can play with online, that you can get this for any county in the country. And it looked like when the black line here is in 2000. The second black line is 2010, just to give you perspective of housing unit growth. And what we can see is, again, Boulder built a couple more housing units this last decade than the previous. But isn't it interesting to see just that complete tank in building in residential units? And we see that for the United States as a whole. We see it for Colorado. We see it for most of our counties. But interesting and hard, I can assume, for an industry to tank and then try and build themselves back up. But that tanking has impacted us in terms of our competitiveness. So we've got the 5th highest median home value and 12th highest median household income. So it makes it really difficult for people to afford to live here. Boulder has an even higher median household income than the state as a whole. It's at about, and you'll probably laugh, you'll like, what? How's it that low? 497,000, and this is a 5-year average looking 2015 to 2019. Median household income at 83,000. If you look at then that ratio of income to home price, it's at about 6. The national average is 3. The state average is 4.7. So it just makes Colorado not really as competitive as other states. Now, are we more competitive than the coast? Yes. Is that why we get people from California and New York? Yes. And that could be our future as well, that we would continue to attract people from higher cost states. So just to tie up kind of the concepts on housing, because it really impacts big things like labor supply, which will directly impact our ability to create job growth. We've got fewer units that came on. We've got an industry that's very slow in recovering. The supply chain is super tight in both supplies as well as in labor. And there's a lot of animosity in terms of public will, and it's across the state. It's not in, I would say that there's probably 2 counties that are pro-growth, that are pro-housing, that you see actively. And it makes it hard, I think, for our future economic viability if we don't have housing for our workers. And this is a Chamber of Commerce event, right? Or stop growing jobs. That's wrong, right? Yes. So this is where you guys play such an important role, talking with the housing community and about how do we do this better. Because I'm pro-job, but we really need housing to put those people in. On the demand side, we need to be very cognizant of the fact that we're aging, and that's impacting housing, that we've got then these two fairly significant generations aging in. We've got more money due to COVID. We had a lot of people forego trips, weddings, and they've got stimulus checks, so that increased the demand. But I also want you guys to all think about investors in housing, and think about institutional investors as well as the cannabis industry. And this comes from both some initial research as well as some anecdotes that there's a lot of institutional investors buying up single-family homes and not renting them. Thousands. That's a challenge. Cannabis doing the same thing. It's tough with the banking industry with cannabis, so where do they put their dollars? Cash for homes and SITs. Again, one of the things that we saw interestingly between 2010 and 2020 in terms of vacancy is we saw vacancy rates actually increase in Denver, Arapahoe County, Douglas County, Boulder County. And some of that vacancy could be institutional investors holding on to housing and not renting them. So it's something else to be thinking about in terms of housing. Last thing I'm going to quickly mention is we're becoming more racially and ethnically diverse. We see that our diversity index increased from, and of course it's too far away for me to see, my old eyes, 46% to 52%, meaning that if asked at random, two people, you select them from a community, that the likelihood that there'll be two different race ethnic groups. So we increased in Colorado as a whole, we saw that. We've also seen an increase for Boulder County in terms of that change as well. If we look at total population change, again, we increased by 744,000. A third of that growth was in our white non-Hispanic population, meaning 2/3 of the growth was in people of color. So our second largest increase was in our Hispanic population, third largest increase was 2 or more. Then we also had our largest percentage change, though, was in our Asian Pacific Islander population. So we are becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, which will actually make us probably more competitive nationally for businesses as well. A lot of site selectors look at Colorado and they say, "Yeah, you're just not diverse enough." So we're starting to build that diversity, which is important. Interestingly, under 18, we saw an interesting change. So we increased only by 38,000. And of that, we saw an absolute decline in our white population. In our white non-Hispanic experienced an absolute decline. Our largest increase was our 2 or more, and then our Hispanic population, and then our Asian population. So where we're seeing a diversity increase is really at our youngest adults. Our young adults is an exaggeration, they're not adults at all. In our youngest population, under 18, we see that fastest growth in diversity. Important to be looking at diversity, primarily because, again, it's our fastest growth population across the board, fastest growth in our labor force, and we still see a lot of disparities. So we see a big disparity in educational attainment, and that's really important because I hope you've taken away from this, our supply of workers is in danger. We're just not growing them like we used to, and if we plan on growing jobs, we need everyone to be super good. And so that means making sure that our educational attainment and other activities across the board are even better. Education then directly correlates to income. Income directly is equal to the economy and driving the economy, which then also includes homeownership. So last piece, what is our forecast? We are forecasting a slowdown out into the future long run. Annual average growth slowing down. Net migration slowing down in the long run, but in the short run, hopefully bouncing back to fill some positions. We've seen international migration slow. Hopefully that will come back up, and that will also impact Boulder as well. Boulder has a higher share of international migrants than other counties. With that being curtailed during the pandemic, we'll hopefully start to see a little bit of an increase in that area. Where will work from anywhere impact that migration? God knows, right? It's hard to tell right now how competitive Colorado is going to be. We hear stories of people leaving the state, taking that Colorado job and doing it from Kansas. Help them. That's so mean. But we also know that people are coming from California and other countries and working in Colorado. So what will the net be? I think it's still uncertain to know. But we may feel them even though they're only part-time. And certainly the mountain communities are feeling that. They're like, oh, the homes are full. And I'm like, yeah, with visitors. Because that is what a kind of a work from anywhere, the digital nomad is. They are just a visitor. And so they don't get counted in the total population. Will this be a boom for rural Colorado? Who knows? It could be, but it also depends on adequate Wi-Fi, daycare, and housing. Housing is not just an issue in the Denver metro area, it's also an issue across the state. We know that people can telecommute. We've seen us do it, but it's been diminishing as a share over time, over COVID. What will be that ultimate number of people that can work remotely? I don't know. It's somewhere, I think, between 16 and 20%. Our forecast is to slow down out into the future. We see a bounce back in the short run and then long run, as you saw in that earlier slide, slowing down simply because the U.S. is slowing down and job growth in the U.S. is slowing down. But that still means about 1.8 additional people in the state between now and 2050. Primarily along the Front Range, unless we do things differently, but we can't do that much that differently. So we are forecasting those increases. And people ask a lot of questions about, well, what about housing? What about water? What about, you're right, there are a lot of risks to the forecast. There's a lot of uncertainty in that forecast. We know that the pandemic is an uncertainty. We know that international migration is an uncertainty. Housing and water, I think, are really those top four in terms of uncertainty in this forecast. But Colorado is still, I would say, relatively well positioned, and Boulder County is relatively well positioned to grow simply because we're young. We're still young relative to other states, so that births minus deaths is still positive. That will create that increase, and we're still growing jobs. So with that, I want to thank you guys very much for your attention, and we'll turn it over to my colleagues. Or no, I will turn it over to you, sorry. Thank you guys very much.
Don't forget your earring.
I know. Did anybody see where it flew? Here,
You can
introduce, and I'll just hang out back here.
Well, I'm going to call you up for another appearance. You know, Elizabeth, I absolutely love the data and I love the stories, but what I love the most is the way you tell the stories. So thank you again so much, and for all of us here, thank you so much. And you found your earring, yes. Thanks again. Well, we're sort of at the midway point of our keynote presentation portion of this evening. And so along those lines, we have something that might be called the Willy Wonka and the Golden Ticket exercise. We have an opportunity for those folks who are here in person. We have 3 prizes for 3 lucky people. Underneath your seat, there may be a blue tag that says winner. So in an effort to kind of get up and refresh yourself before we go into the next phase, and we have a couple of empty seats, so I'll just leave that to you all to tackle and block accordingly here. So. All right, first one to win. Nope. Maris, you might want to help us out. Ah, there's one. All right. There's 2. There's one more to be found. All right, number 4 or 3. Very good. So on behalf and compliments of the Boulder Economic Council, it's something that I think adorns all of our kitchen tables, countertops, and desks. It's a wireless battery charger for your phone, your iBuds, your iWatch, or whatever you have to charge. So thank you very much. Well, without further ado, now that we're all refreshed here in person, and hopefully those of you who are watching online have an opportunity to take a breather, we are now privileged to have some people that have been a long-standing supporter of the Boulder Economic Council. It's really our go-to people for our economic information and our local content. We're just in such a privileged position to have CU Boulder in our backyard, and more so to have Rich Wobbekind and Brian Lewandowski working with us over these years. So without any further ado, I'll call Rich to the stage, and we'll continue with our keynote presentation.
So we joke about these things, but unenviable position of following Elizabeth and being before the happy hour is always challenging. So let me sort of start with that. I want to highlight not only all of the great things that you just heard in the last 45 or 50 minutes, but also that those things have a very important impact on the macroeconomy, not just here in business decision making at the micro level, which is great, but I mean, just at the highest level, if we have this slowing population growth rate nationally, it's really going to seriously impact GDP growth. So you think about that in terms of what does that mean for international migration and so on. And Elizabeth sort of referred to this, but I've been up in the mountains a few times presenting in different communities. They can't find employees right now because the international visas are down so dramatically in the US. So you have those kinds of issues out there as well. And certainly the aging of the population in terms of the demographics, what kind of stress and strain that's going to put on government finance at the state level, but very much at the national level in terms of, you know, Medicare and in some cases it's going to be Medicaid, and also, of course, Social Security. So in a government that, in a debt situation that has basically ballooned at this point in time, we're going to be going into an era of even greater demands on government finance and even slower potential economic growth, GDP growth, and that's what most people are forecasting. So these demographic things are huge. The aging of the population are huge when we talk about the macro forecast. We're looking at this situation. One other key point that Elizabeth raised at the very end, she's talking about uncertainty in a 30-year forecast. I mean, it's almost humorous to me to be talking about uncertainty. We have uncertainty in a one-year forecast. So when we're looking at a 30-year forecast, there's just so many parameters that are shifting. So I'll say that as well. And I do want to say that we gave serious consideration, all of us who are speaking here today, about the situation where we're speaking in a time when people have had such great hardship, and we all know that, and many people in this room in different organizations have helped out tremendously, and it's just wonderful to be part of a community like that. All of that said, and the senator, former governor, sort of said this in the very beginning, a solid business support system is absolutely critical for the long run growth and success of the area, to help support the people and to keep everything in place. And so we came to the conclusion at the end of the day, we really needed to be talking about what we think is happening in the broader economy and in a greater context. So my task is to lay down a little bit of what we're seeing at the national macro level, including monetary policy, and talk a little bit about the state and our state forecast at the front end, and then pass the baton on to my colleague Brian to talk more about the state level data and also about the Boulder specific information. Now, when we look at this situation, so then I got two. At top of the mind and creating the greatest uncertainty is the COVID situation. You're well aware of that. According to a lot of the information, including today's New York Times sort of lead article, it appears to have hit its peak in many, many parts of the country and is subsiding, especially the Northeast. It certainly appears to be less severe in most cases and less impactful. It's looking more like this is going to be our next version of the flu at this point, so I guess that part at least is good news. And I say that because we have seen economic impacts this first quarter from the surge in Omicron. We've seen cancellation of theater and sporting types of events, or at least attendance at those events. We have seen restaurant reservations go down, travel go down. So a lot of the services industries that were impacted so severely by the original COVID shutdown and have just started to get back on their feet are now taking another hit. And this sort of shows up in our economic data as we go along. I'll kind of refer to that in just a moment. So in the broad economic picture, we look at GDP, of course, as the sort of main economic indicator. And one of the things that you've already heard and know is that GDP has grown back to its previous peak, and it happened in a very sort of rapid fashion with tremendous amounts of government stimulus helping to support that growth. We're also pretty familiar with that. But we also know, as I just mentioned, that some of the high frequency indicators that we're looking at right now, like restaurant bookings and hotel bookings and all of those types of things, are slowing off of their previous peak and recent peak. And because of that, we're anticipating a slow first quarter for GDP growth, positive but slower. We've also seen, I should have said, retail sales numbers slowing as well. And all of that dampens our forecast for GDP growth for the year down to the sort of high 3s to 4% range. Now, that's not horrible. That's great by historical standards, but it's just not what we anticipated going into the year. We were thinking 4.5% or more, and now this has been dampened down based on the slowdown and sort of the first quarter numbers. Looking at the individual components of GDP are a key element here, and basically what you can see from the graphic in the upper left is consumption continues to be a driver, and we know that's 70% of GDP. Business fixed investment has also been very strong in the bottom left side quadrant, and you can see the forecast with the striped bars that we have for those components through the quarters going out in time. Government spending, which has gone up and down with stimulus checks or not, but continues out into our future after the next 2 quarters. It continues to be a contributor to overall economic growth. And the only thing that's really dampening the economic growth right now somewhat significantly is the trade deficit. We are increasing our imports dramatically. Our recovery of the U.S. economy has been stronger and faster than other parts of the world. At the same time, our exports are falling and our imports are rising, and our trade deficit is getting larger. And for those who are less familiar with the accounting process of GDP, that turns out as a negative or slows GDP growth down when you are exporting more, importing more than you're exporting. So that's the dampening factor, if you will. There is some concern, as I've mentioned, that the consumption number will be a little bit lower just because of this surge of the Omicron that we've seen. We haven't seen the same recovery exactly, though, when we talk about the employment. We've seen a slower recovery, and we're still down through December about 2.5 million jobs from where we were at our previous peak. So we're doing well in terms of output. We're not doing as well in terms of employment. And part of the issue here, of course, is in this recovery is whether or not people are going to be coming back to the workforce, the so-called participation rate. And we really did, you have to see all these slides, you're going to say that was cut down, but we cut down a lot of slides because of the timing of the event tonight. But the participation rates are lower right now, the labor force participation, than they've been any time going back to 1980. So we're really looking at fewer people in the workforce. Some of it is a direct result of what Elizabeth was describing to you, people getting older. They exited the workforce with the Omicron event. They may have exited to take care of people at home. They may have exited homeschooling, but many people exited who were not in that bracket, who were 55 and above, who wound up going out of the workforce. And unlike 2008 and 2009, when housing market collapsed and our financial retirement accounts collapsed, this time, oh my gosh, my house went up 20%. Oh my gosh, my retirement portfolio went up 25%. I don't need this job. I'm retiring. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a little personal. So when you're thinking about this, just sort of put it in that context. As we move along here, this just highlights the months to recovery and shows you how much more dramatic this was in depth of employment loss, but also in how quickly we're getting back. And at this point, even though we're down that 2.5 million jobs, we think that we'll get back to the same level of employment by the end of the year, which will be roughly a 3-year time horizon, 2.5 to 3-year time horizon, and so much more rapid than the 2008 recession, which you see that long tan line. That was a recession that it was very different from this recession in the sense that it first of all, it lasted longer in terms of time duration. This was a 2-month recession. But secondly, it was a financial recession. We had a collapse of the financial system with the regular economy. And financial recessions have much longer times to recovery, are much slower in terms of building jobs back. And in the US, we've only had 2 financial recessions, the Great Depression and the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. We look at the unemployment rate right now, and it looks pretty impressive. Under 4%, this is great. And some people are questioning whether or not that's full employment already. It was lower, 3.7, 3.6, before we went into COVID. I think a lot of people believe it can get lower than it is right now if we get rid of some of the structural sorts of issues that are there, the job training to the actual jobs that are available. But still, it's very low in sort of historical context, and it's part of the reason why there's been this increased concern by the Federal Reserve. When we have inflation and we have this low unemployment rate, they're concerned about whether or not the inflation may continue in terms of wage inflation and so on. More about that in a little bit. So this shows you the unemployment rates for various groups, and again, going to Elizabeth's comment about this is not equally distributed, you will see on this particular case that based on educational attainment, the unemployment rate, for example, is lower. The more highly educated you are, you have lower unemployment rates. But I really want to point out 2 quick things on this, if I can pivot around for a second. You can see 2 groups, the 16 to 19-year-olds, and down here, less than a high school diploma. Those 2 groups have a lower unemployment rate now than they had in February of 2020 before the recession. So a clear indication that the workforce right now, employers right now are saying, we'll take people younger. We've seen all of these things in the newspaper and on the television. We'll take people younger. We'll take people less educated and train them. No high school diploma, and we'll still take that person and we'll train them because we can improve their quality of life, and they're dipping much deeper into that pool than we have seen historically. So one of the things that shows up here, and this is a slide where I need to move along a little faster. I'm looking at my watch and I'm looking at Brian getting nervous over there. So this particular slide has a lot of highlights. I know it doesn't really look like it when you're looking at it from your seats there. You got 4 quadrants, they're different colors, isn't that lovely? But the upper green quadrant is transfer payments. So you can see 3 distinct spikes where we had the tax rebate checks. And I haven't hidden my feelings about this before, so I'm not hiding them here tonight. I think this was way over stimulus in terms of the amount of people who received tax rebate checks in terms of income brackets, people who hadn't lost their jobs. I know I'm offending people as I say this. People who hadn't lost their jobs or were making under $200,000 were getting tax rebate checks. And we're paying the price for that a little bit right now in the country. We have inflation. The inflation is being created by supply chain issues, supply side inflation, but also by demand side issues. And right now we're sitting with $2.6 trillion of excess savings on the books. Excess meaning that's the amount that was driven by all of this extra stimulus we put in the economy. And if you look at the actual data on who's holding that, 90% are people who already own homes. 70% are people in the top income bracket in the country. I mean, people who got these checks in the top income brackets put the money in the bank. They saved it. Well, that's a good thing, except all of that excess savings is sitting out there and really didn't stimulate the economy. So that puts, again, this continued inflationary pressure for a longer time in terms of potential of bidding up all these different types of services, automobiles, and other types of things that we see out there. Okay, other highlights that aren't me sort of giving you my view of the world. The tan box in the upper right, what you see is wages being at the highest level that they've been. So this is good news, the private sector taking over, and we see wages back to the highest levels. Proprietor income in the bottom left, the red box, you see that is also getting very close to the previous peak, so that's good news. And dividends, interest, and rents, other sort of payments also at a record level. So as we see this tapering or falling off of the transfer payments, with no federal additional unemployment insurance, with no more tax checks coming back. As we see that kind of wane a little bit, we're seeing it filled by the regular economy, the typical sources of income from the rest of the economy. How does that play out in terms of confidence? In particular, consumer confidence we're seeing impacted right now in a not great way, and it's really showing up in the data as a reflection of concerns about inflation. They're not as concerned about the job market, so the consumer confidence survey on the left focuses a little bit more on jobs. The consumer sentiment survey on the right focuses their question base a little bit more on inflation, and that survey is way down off of where it was because consumers are in fact expressing concerns about the prices they're paying for products. Looking at the inflation, I'm sure you're reading the headlines. They're in the paper and on the news almost every month when the CPI comes out. We're at very high levels of inflation in sort of historical standards. It has forced the Fed to sort of rethink their position and to become much more aggressive on monetary policy. I'm sure you've seen that as well. But I think a lot of people who follow this closely and follow the pieces of this closely think that the November, December was kind of the peak in terms of this inflation, year-over-year inflation increases. We've seen retail energy prices like gasoline start to pull back. Some of the other prices in the economy that were really driving inflation are pulling back. We haven't seen as much in either medical or shelter at this point. So those are other categories that we're watching closely. When we look at confidence in the business side of things, the Institute for Supply Management shows both the manufacturing sector in the economy and the services sector. So these are bigger companies that would have a supply chain manager or a purchasing manager who's filling out these surveys, and they're feeling pretty great. Even with the supply chain issues, they feel that the economy's on pretty firm footing, their sales look good, the industry profits look good, they're feeling good about life. But you don't see the same thing when you look at the National Federation of Independent Business Index, which is the NFIB, is small businesses, millions of them literally responding to the survey that they do monthly. And small businesses are showing definite concerns about inflation, about wage increases of workers, and certainly about what the surge in Omicron might be doing to their operational thing. Would they have to reduce the number of tables? Will they see less retail traffic? And so on. So you do see sort of a differing view based on the size of business when we look at business optimism. So moving along to a little bit of monetary policy, one thing that's going on is we know that the Federal Reserve is tapering their balance sheet, meaning they're selling off some of their debt. This is, or they're not refinancing their bonds as they're coming due each month. This is something that has created some concern about longer-term interest rates in the economy, since that's the whole objective of this process, was to keep longer-term rates down. And if everything else were equal, you would typically think if the Fed is purchasing less of these particular securities, then, and the federal government is continuing to issue more and more of this because the debt has been going up so significantly, the federal debt, you would expect the interest rates to be rising and rising at a somewhat significant rate. But everything else isn't the same. We have a world awash in liquidity. We have $2.6 trillion of excess savings that I just mentioned to you in the US alone, held by citizens in the US. And then again, as I mentioned, the global stuff that's going on. So you put those pieces together, and it's unclear, with the Fed pulling out of this market slowly, if we are going to see a surge in the 2-year or 10-year bond rates. We have seen some movement up, but I haven't seen a forecast that really shows those long rates going up very dramatically, even through 2023. The issue there as we go forward, so here's a longer term forecast that we're sort of using, that does go up when you get to 24 and 25. You do start to see these higher interest rates. But again, in long run historical context, if you look at this, go back over to the left-hand side, even by 2024 and 2025, they're not particularly high in the long run context. And certainly not in the kind of inflationary environment we're in now. I didn't say, by the way, when I was talking about the inflation slide, but we're thinking about 4+% for 2022, the year we're in. Certainly seems reasonable after a significantly higher number in 2021. And the survey from the Conference Board that just came out today of CEOs indicates that they believe the inflation is going to be with us into 2023, not just for 2022, and they're probably closer to it than most of us are. The Fed has also announced, and this has been printed through their dot plot diagram that came out in December. You can see that they're anticipating movements up. Back in September, they weren't anticipating much of a move up at all in 2022. Now they're looking like the average move looks like it's going to be 3 rate increases for the year, still, taking us up to the 75 to 1% range. And now as early as, say, March might be the first move. So this is an interesting sort of change in a really short period of time, as they realized the inflation had moved from transitory to a little bit more permanent than they thought. Those who are Fed watchers know that they've even taken that lingo out of their presentations. So this outlook for Colorado is in our publication. It's available on our website. You'll see a reference to that at the end when Brian is done. And couple of slides at the front. One is when we gave this presentation, and we were talking about this in the presentation, I said, well, I think we're clearly forecasting an economy that probably is not a top 10 economy in the US. Now, for many years, we have been a top 10 or even a top 5 economy, and Elizabeth kind of highlighted that in terms of population growth for the decade. But the more recent one-year data is mixed. Some things we're doing really well in, as you can see, and some things we're doing not as well in terms of labor force growth and in terms of unemployment rate, which I think is a little deceptive, but we're not up there. When you look down at sort of the other pieces, though, you see some personal income, for example. The personal income growth rate is really strong. So we do have some things that kind of make us top 10, but some things that make us top 20, if you will. And you tell people, well, I think we're going to be a top 15 economy, and you think the sky fell. like 15, come on, we're never 15, we're always 10, 5, but we have sectors in this state that are going to take a longer time to heal, particularly travel, tourism, and accommodations. They're pretty significant sectors in the state. So I think it does portend for a little bit maybe slower growth, even with the great high tech, the great manufacturing sectors, and some of the other things that are so strong in the state. This particular growth map kind of shows you that. The tan and the darker tan for Nevada and Hawaii are the strongest growth. Shows in this particular through November, we're kind of in a decent position, but we're not necessarily at the top. And this was our forecast that we came out with, and when we released in December, and it shows a little bit slower job growth for 2022. Some of that is predicated on the fact that we have such a tight labor force. We don't know where the people are coming from to fill these jobs. Elizabeth stated it very accurately. A job is until it's filled, it's not really a job. You have to have a person on that, and so we don't know where these people are coming from at this point in terms of slow population growth and other pieces. Still, we get the state's overall population, overall employment up to the same level by the end of the year as it was pre-COVID. So with that, I pass the baton to my taller, younger, more talented, and more handsome colleague, Brian, to talk about the sectoral analysis and more.
So before I pick it up, I just want to note that Rich said he had the unenviable position of presenting after Elizabeth and before the happy hour. He didn't mention my name in there, but so I'm the last thing before we get to the happy hour. So Rich really showed you the national macroeconomic environment. He showed you our forecast for 2022. I'm going to break it down a little bit into the sector level and then really zoom into Boulder. So the 87,000 jobs that we are forecasting for 2022 are spread across these 11 sectors or so. Just note that 80% of the jobs that we have adding in Colorado are in 5 industries. And 40% of the jobs added are in one industry, the leisure and hospitality industry, okay? That's really the great recovery that we see coming in leisure and hospitality. It's the fastest pace of growth. It's the most jobs that we have adding back in Colorado. But when we take a look at the industries that we still expect to be in deficit from their pre-pandemic level, 6 of these industries do not get back to that peak level in 2022. And leisure and hospitality, interestingly, is one of them. There are 2 industries that have the greatest deficit at the end of 2022. One is the mining industry, which we project to be down about 28% from their pre-pandemic peak, and leisure and hospitality, which will still have a deficit of about 2.4%. So at the end of the year, though, we think Colorado overall will be about 18,000 above that 2019 level. It'll be 0.6% above that pre-pandemic level. So that's a pretty good indicator. We are pretty optimistic. When we take a look at this basket of economic metrics, Rich mentioned that GDP has surpassed its pre-pandemic peak. We have employment on this recovery trajectory. He showed you that Colorado may not be a top 10 state, but we're still in the top quartile for most economic metrics. And jobless claims, I think, is one of those optimistic metrics, where in 2019, the average jobless claim, so think about this, when you lose your job, one of the first things you do is you go out and you file for your unemployment benefits. Our jobless claims in 2019 averaged about 1,900 a week, pretty consistently. And you can see the spike that happened because of the pandemic. But over the last 3 months, we've averaged about 2,100 per week. And some of those weeks, we actually dipped below 1,900 per week. So that's a really good sign that that labor market is healing. And same with continued claims, so people who are getting their unemployment benefits for multiple weeks, this has really come down to pre-pandemic levels. Unemployment rate, another one of these labor metrics that we look at. Colorado's unemployment rate is at 5.1%. So yes, it is higher than the national rate. But when we take a look at this over time, we see that Colorado's unemployment rate in 2019 averaged 2.7%, spiked to over 12% in the worst part of the pandemic. So certainly a recovery, but we see all of these help wanted signs. And I think this is kind of interesting. I've never heard so many employers clamoring for workers as I have during this period right now. So it feels like there's sort of competing conclusions in some of this data. And why do we have this higher unemployment rate when there are so many employers looking for workers? A couple of interesting points. Our labor force is now 1.4% higher in Colorado than it was prior to the pandemic. We have 40,000 more people in the labor force than we had prior to the pandemic. But the other thing that we need to remember is prior to the pandemic compared to now, we have about 900,000 fewer people nationally that are dual job holders. So maybe you had someone who was working at a ski resort during the day and working a restaurant job at night, and they were dual job holders. 900,000 fewer of those, that's certainly impacting our labor market and impacting employers' abilities to find workers. So this is a little in the weeds in the data, but when we take a look at the unemployment rate and when we take a look at labor force, those are people. So one person is in the labor force. But when we take a look at all of these jobs numbers that we're sharing with you, those are jobs, and it can be one person holding multiple jobs. So that's part of the tension that we see in the data. When we take a look at the unemployment rate by county across the state, it's certainly improved really across the board. Boulder's unemployment rate is now the 14th lowest in the state. It's the second lowest in the major metropolitan counties in the state. So things are certainly improving here. Lowest rate, if you're curious, is Baca County in the lower right-hand corner at 2%. The highest rate is in San Miguel County, out where on the western slope where Telluride is. We've shown you this slide before. This shows the average employment losses, well, benchmarked back to January of 2020, the employment losses for the group of industries that pay below $50,000 a year, the job losses for industries paying $50 to $75 a year and above $75 a year. So early on in the pandemic, we showed where the vast majority of job losses were in these lower paying industries. These are retail, hotel, restaurants, other services. And what we were really highlighting is that group of industries really bore the brunt of the job losses, the pandemic losses. You can relate to this because of the forced shutdowns of many of these industries during the early days of the pandemic. The highest paying industries were comparatively unaffected. But the good news now is those highest paying industries are now above their pre-recession peak. Even the lower paying industries now are, that gap is closing. It's about a 4% deficit compared to a deficit of almost 30% early on during the pandemic. We're seeing wage growth. This is taking a look at average weekly wages. We're seeing about 4.4% wage growth year over year when we take a look at a 3-month average, slightly higher than the nation. One thing that's interesting to me here is when we take a look over the longer term, over the last 10 years, Colorado's actually had slower wage growth than the nation. That was sort of a surprise to me. When we take a look at an alternative measure, the per capita personal income, Colorado has the 9th highest per capita personal income in the US. And we have the 5th fastest rate of growth for per capita personal income in the US. So, zooming into the metro areas in Colorado, 5 of our metropolitan areas in the state are in the bottom half for growth nationally. And 4 of them are in the top quartile for growth nationally, okay? Denver is now speeding up its recovery. It was lagging for a while, but the Denver MSA is showing the fastest growth year over year. Boulder is not far behind. We're 60th in the country when it comes to year-over-year job growth among all of the 330 or so metropolitan areas, okay? But this is Boulder's employment growth over time. So this is a Boulder MSA or Boulder County, okay? So the official data that's come out from the State Labor Office is that year over year, Boulder's job growth is 4.9% or 9,000 jobs. And just to call this out, that means that we still have a deficit of 3.7% or 7,500 jobs. But they also published this series that's called the Expected Revisions to the Official Series. And I kind of like this because it's better data. It's reported from all employers, but the data lags a little bit. But what it's showing is Boulder County is actually outperforming those early estimates. So if we account for those expected revisions, we're only down about 1.4%. We're only down about 2,900 jobs from that pre-recession peak. And so like the state, we expect Boulder County's employment to recover those job losses in 2022. So right now, this data goes through November of 2021. We're 21 months into this event, and we've recovered 89% of our job losses in Boulder County, okay? As a point of reference, 21 months into the Great Recession, we were just hitting the bottom of our job losses in Boulder County. So we hadn't even started the recovery yet. And that recovery ended up taking 4.5 years before we returned to a new record level or new peak employment. And we think that Boulder County is going to be back there in about a total of 2.5 years from the start of this event. So you've heard us describe Boulder County's industry composition before. We have the most jobs really about 2/3 of jobs in 5 industries: professional and technical services. This is engineering, R&D, design type jobs. Government, including federal, state, and local government. Manufacturing. I wouldn't think of Boulder as a major manufacturing center, but that's one of our major employers in Boulder County. Healthcare and social assistance, and retail trade. So think back to where we were projecting job growth for 2022. It hits many of our major industries that we have in Boulder County. And we also term this in looking at location quotients, or the concentration of employment by industry. Do you know that Boulder has 3 times the national average of information, software publishing type employment? About 3 times the national average of professional and technical services employment. So these are some of our key industries locally. When we take a look at Boulder's job recovery through November of 2021, there's 2 ways that we look at it. On the left-hand side, you can see from February of 2020, which was Boulder's peak, to November of 2021. And on the right side, you can take a look at November 2020 to November 2021. So just taking a look year over year. So on the right side, you can see growth in every industry. Financial activities is flat, but we'll call that a win. On the left side, though, you see that only 4 of our industries have returned to peak levels. We still have ground to recover in 6 of our major industries here. Just want to touch on a couple of key industries in Boulder County. One is construction. So statewide, we are expecting 2022 to be the highest value of production of construction in the state in our recorded history. Okay, but these are in nominal terms, meaning that it's not adjusted for inflation. And what we've seen is an increase in price of building materials and of labor costs. So even though we've seen an increase of real production, part of this increase in value is due to the price inflation that we've seen. When we take a look at Boulder County, this is an area that's outperformed the state. We've seen even faster increases in the value of construction locally. We see increases in residential, in non-residential, and in non-building or infrastructure development here. We also watch building permits. So building permits is sort of a leading indicator of construction starts and homes that will get started. We think that 2021 was the highest level of building permits in 20 years. And 2022, we expect to be very similar. And so, we're looking at 30% growth or so overall. The story is different, though, when we zoom into the Boulder MSA. Instead of going up, we saw a decrease in residential building permits from 2020 to 21. And we saw a decrease in both single-family and multifamily. But if you take a look at the black bars there, the single-family production is about a quarter of what we saw 4 years ago in Boulder County. Prices are growing, of course, and prices in Boulder County are up about 17% when we take a look at the Federal Housing Finance Agency metric. 17% growth year over year. And do you know that's only good enough for about 150th best in the country? We're seeing phenomenal growth all across the country when it comes to home prices. When we look at the Boulder Longmont Realtor Association data, which has been tracking this for years, it's a similar story, but this shows that the median price was up 29% in the city of Boulder over the last year with data through December. Days on the market were down. We saw the median home price was $1.25 million. So this shows that the market has gotten even tighter and more constrained over the last year. A couple of other metrics that we're watching, sales tax collections. This was a real fear point when the recession started. We were wondering what was going to happen with public revenues. And we did see a short-term blip statewide when it came to sales tax collections, but we saw sales tax collections actually rebound and increase over 2019 levels in 2020. And this continued on in 2021. A similar story in the city of Boulder. That dip was a little bit longer, but the city of Boulder has returned and surpassed pre-pandemic peak. We can see that October, when we take a look at the 12-month average, up 13.9% year over year. That's just phenomenal. And taking a look back to the last normal year, in October of 2019, up 6.6%. So there's a number of contributing factors to this. Depends on the type of retail you have locally. Are they big box or Main Street stores? How dependent you are on tourism, daily commuters. Has there been new greenfield development, like places like Aurora that continued to build new retail through the pandemic, and population growth? So I like to take a look and benchmark to other communities. So this is taking a look at the 30 largest taxing jurisdictions in Colorado, and I ordered this based on their growth compared to October of 2019. So looking at the first 10 months of 2019 compared to the first 10 months of 2021. Almost every one of these jurisdictions is up, and most of them are way up. Places like Castle Rock, they're up over 40%. Commerce City up about 35%. So a real recovery in retail. Tourism is important to us as a state. It's important to us as a local community. There's one benchmark that we watch here, and it's, are people returning to Colorado by air? Do you know that DIA is getting close to its pre-pandemic peak? Do you know that DIA is the third busiest airport in the world right now? Do you know that we have, depending on the month, we have the first or second or third most domestic connections in the United States? It's a real asset for Colorado, and it's a healthy sign to see that number returning. One metric that we've talked about locally, of course, Rich and I work at the University of Colorado, and we worried about how the shutdown of in-person learning last year would impact the Boulder economy. The good news is that enrollment has rebounded, and we are now at peak enrollment at the University of Colorado. We're up 2.6% year over year. And just to call out our business school and the engineering school, up 3.4% and 6.6% in terms of enrollment. So it's a real comforting sign, I think at least to us, to see a return in enrollment at the University of Colorado. So I think the three of us have chatted about some of the concerns that we have. We survey business leaders quarterly and ask them these questions. What are you worried about? And they tell us about COVID, of course. They tell us about the worker shortage. They tell us about inflation and the supply chain. Sometimes they mention interest rates as being a concern. But despite all of those concerns that are out there, business leaders are still registering optimism. So when they look out one quarter and they look out 2 quarters, so halfway through 2022, they are recording increasing optimism. So they are rosy about the future of the economy and the future of their industry as they look through 2022. So I'm not going to read all of these tailwinds and headwinds, but again, when we take a look at this basket of economic metrics, if it's GDP or income or employment recovery, whatever these metrics are, we can always find some that are trending in the wrong direction, right? Maybe it's the COVID cases, or maybe it's inflation. But when we take a look at this basket of metrics, there's overwhelming evidence that the economy is on this growth recovery. And so I think that's why we're optimistic as we look through 2022. And with that, Scott, I will turn it back to you.
Well, thank you. I'm reminded of a phrase, or perhaps it's a curse, I'm not quite sure. May you live in interesting times. I'm sure you've heard about that. I certainly think that tonight's program has highlighted that we indeed are living in interesting times. The Boulder Economic Council, and as well as the Boulder Chamber, focuses on networks and trying to bring people like yourselves that have joined us tonight together so that we can face these challenges and indeed these interesting times. So I just want to say thank you to all of you that have participated this evening. I want to say thank you to our speakers, Rich, Brian, and Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's truly a pleasure. We will do it again next year. I also want to have a shout out to the folks that joined us at the beginning of the program. So Senator Hickenlooper, Angie Martinez, and Alejandra Castillo. It's just fantastic to see that at every level of government and every level of the community that we have support to not only recover from the pandemic, but also from the natural disaster that now is sitting on top of the pandemic. So let's a round of applause for thanking those folks that joined us this evening. I also want to recognize at this point just some folks that make this stuff happen. 2 individuals in particular, colleagues of mine at the Chamber, Maya Cordero, who's back there behind the screens that are making everything beautiful for this evening. And I'm not sure where she is, my partner in crime at the Boulder Economic Council, Corinne Waldau. Thank you so much for that. And lastly, you see some folks with Boulder Chamber badges on. We call them our ambassadors. They do a fantastic job facilitating and helping with these events. So thank you to the events team at the Chamber and the staff team and the ambassadors for helping us out this evening. So thank you again. And with that, there's only one last thing to do, and I literally am standing between you and the happy hour. And that is to once again recognize the sponsors for this evening's event. So I want to say thank you to Michael and the Elevations Credit Union for their presenting support. I would also like to thank the City of Boulder for their ongoing support for events such as these. I'd like to thank our supporting sponsors. Thank you so much for your engagement throughout the year and making, again, this and other events possible for us. And last and certainly not least, our media sponsors that are listed in your programs this evening. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you all here in person, and also thank you all who are visiting here virtually and attending the meeting. We very much appreciate your attention and scope, and hopefully tonight has been informative. I know it has been for me. So thank you again, and we'll see you soon.